Rosie the Riveter. Part 1. The Unlikely Soldiers of the Home Front. The morning air in Wilmington, Delaware, on December 8, 1941, was cold and sharp with a new kind of fear. In the modest kitchen of her duplex, Eleanor Walsh, 27, listened to President Roosevelt's voice crackle from the radio with a sinking heart. Her husband, Jack, a machinist at the local DuPont plant, sat utterly still, his hand tightening around his coffee mug until his knuckles were white. Their world, already weathered by the long anxiety of the Depression, had been cleaved in two by a single word from a place called Pearl Harbor. As the speech ended, Jack looked at her, his eyes holding a mixture of resolve and anguish. "I have to go, Ellie," he said simply. Eleanor's war began not with a bang, but with a quiet, seismic shift in the fabric of her life. Within weeks, Jack was at Fort Dix, and their modest savings began to dwindle. The help-wanted ads in the Wilmington Morning News had always been segmented. Men wanted for skilled trades. Women wanted for clerical, sales, or domestic work. But now, a new, tentative, and revolutionary phrase began to appear. Men or women. It was often in smaller print, almost an afterthought, for positions like light assembly. The first call came from the very plant Jack had left. DuPont, converting to cordite and other explosives, needed hands. Eleanor, who had worked as a bookkeeper before having their daughter, Mary, applied with a tremor of defiance. The personnel manager, a Mr. Henderson with a pinched face and a ledger book mind, looked over her application as if it were a misdelivered letter. "This is nitrocellulose processing, Mrs. Walsh. It's strenuous. And the chemicals, it's no place for a woman." She met his gaze, channeling a courage she didn't feel. "My husband is in no place for a man, Mr. Henderson, but he's there. I can learn." She was hired, not for processing, but for the bagging line sealing finished powder into cloth sacks. The work was monotonous, the air thick with sweet, acrid dust that clung to her hair and skin. The pay was $32 a week, more than Jack had ever made at the height of the Depression. She opened her first paycheck with a sense of dizzying disbelief. This money would keep the roof over Mary's head, food on the table, and war bonds in the drawer. It was a transaction, but it felt like a metamorphosis. Eleanor's story was a single thread in a national tapestry being woven at breakneck speed. From the shipyards of Kaiser and Portland to the aircraft lines of Lockheed and Burbank, the same scene played out. It was driven by necessity, but also by a powerful propaganda campaign. The government and media conjured a new icon, Rosie the Riveter. She was everywhere on posters with her sleeve rolled up, flexing a bicep under the slogan, "We can do it." In Norman Rockwell's Saturday Evening Post cover, a muscular, overall-clad woman with a rivet gun on her lap, a copy of Mein Kampf crushed under her penny loafer. Rosie was confident, capable, and unmistakably feminine. She was the ideal. The reality, Eleanor quickly discovered, was grittier, more complex, and ultimately more powerful than any poster. She was not Rosie. She was Eleanor, back aching, hands growing rough, learning a language of micrometers and torque wrenches, of shift changes and union meetings. The factory floor was a noisy, male-dominated world that viewed her and the thousands of women arriving daily with a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and often outright hostility. The foremen, old-school craftsmen, doubted their strength and stamina. The remaining male workers resented the dilution of their trade's prestige. The jokes were crude, the skepticism palpable. But necessity is a formidable teacher. Eleanor learned to operate a hand-cranked conveyor, to identify flawed seams in the sacks by touch. She discovered a latent mechanical aptitude, surprising herself by fixing a jamming gear on her station with a well-placed tap from a wrench. She saw women in other sections welding with masks that hid their faces behind terrifying bursts of white light, operating colossal overhead cranes with the delicate precision of pianists, reading complex blueprints with an engineer's focus. The transformation was not just industrial. It was profoundly personal. The shared hardship forged a fierce camaraderie among the women. They covered for each other during childcare emergencies, pooled gas rations for carpooling, shared tips for removing grease from nails and chemical smells from hair. In the cacophonous din of the lunchroom, Eleanor found a new sisterhood of widows, of young girls sending money to soldier brothers, of middle-aged mothers like herself holding families together. They talked of husbands and sons in distant, unimaginable places like Guadalcanal and Tunisia, their worries punctuated by the relentless, comforting proof of their own productivity. Every sealed bag of powder they knew was a tangible answer to a plea from the front. They were no longer just supporting the war effort. They were constituting it. This new identity came with friction at home. Eleanor's letters to Jack were full of a pride she worried might emasculate him. She wrote of her earnings, of learning to change the oil in their decrepit Ford, of the confidence she felt managing their finances alone. His letters back were loving but carried a bewildered tone. He was proud of her, he said, but he missed his girl, the one who needed a jar opened. The old dynamics of their marriage were in a state of suspended animation, and neither knew what would survive when and if he returned. By mid-1943, Eleanor had moved from bagging to quality control, a role that required precision and judgment. She was no longer just a pair of hands. She was a set of eyes trusted to ensure the safety of the product that would propel shells across oceans. One day, Mr. Henderson, the same man who had doubted her, stopped by her station. He watched her methodically check a batch, her hands sure and swift. He grunted, a sound that in his lexicon passed for approval. "Walsh," he said, "we're starting a new line on the plastic molding presses. It's tricky. Think you could train some of the new girls?" In that moment, Eleanor felt it. A seismic shift within herself, as profound as the one that had reshaped the factory. She was not just filling a spot. She was building a new kind of authority, a new place in the world. She looked at the busy floor, a sea of bandanas and determined faces, and understood that the arsenal of democracy was more than machines and munitions. It was a revolution in the making, and she, along with millions of other unlikely soldiers, was on its front line. Part 2. The Sinews of the Arsenal. The Boeing plant in Seattle was a cathedral of industry, so vast its interior fogged with its own weather. Here, the abstract ideal of Rosie met the deafening, oily, magnificent reality of building a B-17 flying fortress. Betty Kowalski, 22 and fresh off a wheat farm in eastern Washington, stood on a scaffolding platform, a bucking bar in one hand, a pneumatic rivet gun in the other. The gun, which the male riveters called the Widowmaker for its brutal kick, felt alien and threatening. Her instructor, a grizzled old-timer named Stan with a face like a worn leather glove, watched her skeptically. "The skin's gotta be tight, honey," he yelled over the omnipresent roar. "No gaps. A gap at 20,000 feet turns this bird into an icebox, then a coffin. You set the rivet, I buck it. Ready?" Betty nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She positioned the gun's cup over the rivet stem, took a breath, and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked violently, the brat-a-tat-tat shocking her entire arm. The rivet mashed, but lopsided. Stan cursed, not at her, but at the wasted part. "Again, don't fight it, guide it. It's a tool, not a tiger." Hour after hour, day after day, she practiced. Her shoulders screamed, her ears rang even in the silence of her boarding house room, and her hands became a map of blisters and minor cuts. The other women in her crew, a former waitress named Gloria, a college graduate named Jean who could calculate stress loads in her head, struggled alongside her. They were the greenhorns, tripping over air hoses, misreading blueprint symbols, enduring the exasperated sighs of the male leads. But they learned. They developed a jargon, a gallows humor. A bad rivet was a dingbat. A foreman on a power trip was suffering from rivet head. They learned to weld seams on fuel tanks, a job requiring zen-like steadiness, in booths so hot their coveralls were soaked through. They learned to install plexiglass gunner bubbles, to run wiring harnesses like neural systems through the fuselage's ribs, to pack parachutes with a ritualistic care that acknowledged a life might one day depend on their neat folds. Betty's transformation was physical and social. The soft curves of her farm girl body hardened with new muscle. The deference expected of her gender evaporated in the functional meritocracy of the production line. Here, value was measured in output, in precision, in showing up on time for the graveyard shift. She found a pride in her calluses, in the grease stain that wouldn't quite wash out from under her fingernails. She was contributing to a tangible, majestic thing. At the end of her shift, she would sometimes watch as her plane, now a seamless silver beast, was towed out for its final inspection. A painter would climb a ladder and, with a few swift strokes, apply the nose art. A sultry pinup, a fierce cartoon animal, a name like Memphis Belle or Flying Horseman. In that moment, the abstract war became personal. Her rivets would hold that plane together. Her wiring would carry the signals for its guns. This new power bled into every aspect of life. With her wages, Betty rented her own room, bought her first pair of slacks, went dancing with GIs on leave without needing a chaperone. She argued politics with Jean, who talked of a post-war world where women kept their jobs. She sent money home to her parents, reversing the flow of dependency. The farm girl who had once dreamed only of marriage and a family near her own now dreamed of maybe staying in the city, of finding a peacetime job that used her new skills. The world had cracked open, revealing possibilities as vast as the factory floor itself. Yet the revolution was incomplete and contested. The glass ceiling of the era was made of solid steel. Women like Betty could be riveters and welders, but they were almost never promoted to leadman or foreman. Their pay, though better than pre-war, was often still less than a man's for the same work, justified under the guise of light or female classifications. The social pressure remained. Magazine articles warned of war widows becoming too masculine, neglecting their children for the selfish lure of the workplace. The underlying message was clear. This was a temporary loan of responsibility, not a permanent transfer of power. Betty felt this tension during a visit from her fiancé, Charlie, a navigator training in Texas. He was proud of her in a patronizing way, calling her his little Rosie. But when she spoke passionately about the bomber's design, about the flaw in a hydraulic line her crew had discovered, his smile became fixed. He wanted to talk about their future farm, about the kids they'd have. He listened to her factory stories as quaint anecdotes, not as chapters in the forging of a new self. A cold dread settled in her stomach. The man she had promised herself to was fighting for a different world than the one she was now building with her own hands. The peak came in 1944. The production lines were a model of furious efficiency, a ballet of coordinated labor where women and men worked in tandem, the old prejudices often worn away by shared purpose and mutual respect earned through competence. America was producing a plane every 5 minutes, a ship every day. The sinews of the arsenal were not just steel and aluminum. They were the resilient muscles and unbreakable will of millions of women like Betty. They had proven, beyond any doubt, that women's work was a meaningless phrase. There was only work, and they could do it all. But even as they riveted and welded, a question hung in the chemical-scented air. What happens when the music stops? When the boys come home and the posters of Rosie are taken down, and the nation, desperate for normalcy, tries to rewind the clock? Betty, watching another fortress roll out, felt a fierce protectiveness over the life she had built. She had become more than a replacement. She had become an essential part of the engine of victory. And some engines, once started, cannot be quietly turned off. Part 3. The Unquiet Peace. May 8, 1945, VE Day. The raucous celebration that erupted across the nation was a catharsis of pent-up fear and grief. In Detroit, at the Chrysler Tank Arsenal, the deafening machinery ground to a halt at the appointed hour. A silence fell, so profound and unfamiliar it was itself a shock. Mabel Jenkins, a 40-year-old widow who had become a master inspector of tank transmissions, stood with her crew amid the silent, half-assembled hulks of Shermans. They cheered, they cried, they hugged. But beneath the joy, Mabel felt a tremor of anxiety. The war in Europe was won. Their raison d'etre was vanishing before their eyes. The memos came within weeks. Reconversion planning. Seniority lists under review. Post-war employment priorities. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. The men were coming home, and they would need their jobs back. The propaganda machine, which had spent 4 years exhorting women into the workforce, now pivoted with breathtaking speed. New articles appeared. How to welcome your hero home. Hint, have a clean house and a quiet dinner. Don't overwhelm him with your problems. Advertisements showed beaming women trading in their overalls for new electric washing machines, their focus happily returning to the domestic sphere. Rosie the Riveter was being retired, repackaged as Molly the homemaker. For Mabel, it felt like a betrayal. The war had given her a life after loss. Her husband, Frank, had died at Pearl Harbor on the Arizona. The job at Chrysler had saved her from a descent into poverty and despair. It had given her not just an income, but a community, a purpose, and a fierce, hard-won competence. She had bought a small house. She had put her son through a good school. She was a respected figure on the line, her stamp of approval the final word on whether a transmission was fit for battle. The thought of surrendering that to make room for a returning veteran, however deserving he was, filled her with a complex brew of guilt and resentment. The pushback was not uniform. Many women, weary of the double shift of factory and home, exhausted by war's anxieties, were happy to leave. They saw their work as a patriotic duty, now completed. Others, like Betty in Seattle, faced direct pressure. When Charlie returned, wounded and haunted, his expectation was clear. He would work the farm with his brother. She would be his wife, full stop. The independence she'd relished was framed as an obstacle to his healing. With a heavy heart, she quit Boeing. But many others, like Mabel and Eleanor, resisted. They had changed, and they refused to shrink back into their old shells. When layoff notices targeted women first, regardless of seniority or skill, they fought back. They used the tools they had learned, organization and solidarity. Mabel, drawing on her union experience, helped organize a women's caucus within the UAW. They lobbied, they petitioned, they argued that they too had seniority, that their skills were vital to the peacetime industries America would need. The results were mixed, often heartbreaking. Millions of women were, indeed, forced out of their high-paying industrial jobs. The female labor force participation rate, which had skyrocketed during the war, dropped significantly by 1947. They were channeled back into feminized sectors' clerical work, teaching, nursing, retail jobs that paid less and offered less autonomy. Yet, to see this as a simple reversion is to miss the profound, permanent crack the war had made in the foundation of American society. The genie could not be fully put back in the bottle. The war had proven a fundamental truth. Women were capable of anything. That knowledge could not be unknown. It resided in the minds of the women themselves and, grudgingly, in the acknowledgement of society. Eleanor Walsh's Jack returned, quieter, older than his years. He went back to DuPont, now reconverting to nylon production. Eleanor, laid off from her QC job, did not return to being a full-time homemaker. Using her wartime experience with logistics and quality systems, she talked her way into an office manager position at a growing trucking company. It was a different kind of work, but it was her career. The dynamic in their marriage had irrevocably shifted. They were partners in a new way, making financial decisions together, because Eleanor had proven herself a capable economic actor. The memory of her wartime competence lingered, a quiet source of power. Betty Kowalski, on the farm with Charlie, found the confines unbearable. In 1948, using her savings, She took a course in business accounting. She now runs the books for 3 local farms and is the treasurer of the county agricultural board. The precision she learned checking bomber blueprints serves her well. And Mabel Jenkins, she never got her inspector's job back at Chrysler. But the union work she did led to a position with a state labor commission, advocating for workplace safety, a direct result of the horrors she'd seen in the rush of wartime production. She became a voice for the worker, a role she would never have imagined before the war. The legacy of the wartime working woman was not a sudden, triumphant feminist revolution. It was a slow-burning fuse. The daughters who saw their mothers build bombers grew up with a broader sense of the possible. The economic necessity that would drive women back into the workforce in the 1950s and 60s met a generation that no longer unquestioningly accepted the old limitations. The war had been a massive, involuntary social experiment, and its results were undeniable. The arsenal of democracy had produced more than weapons. It produced a new archetype, the competent, independent, wage-earning woman. Rosie the Riveter was not just a temporary mascot. She became a permanent part of the American psyche, a symbol of latent power waiting to be called upon. The women who answered that call did more than win a war. They forever altered the landscape of American life, proving that a nation's greatest resource is not just its industrial might, but the untapped potential of half its people. Their fight on the home front didn't end in 1945. It simply entered a new, quieter, but no less determined phase, the long battle for a peace that included the place they had earned.